What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. We are going to start with Move, which has at this point sort of cannibalized the combo space. I think previously we were in a metagame where combo decks were sort of testing themselves against each other. And we have arrived at a point where Move is pretty clearly going to be able to be bigger than a lot of the other combo decks, which has centralized combo a little bit into this deck. And that's not a permanent state of affairs because obviously when something is centralized to that degree, the things that are really good against it become really powerful and make this kind of thing worse. That is very liable to happen to Move, but it is still at a high level of play the single best deck in the game. There are very good reasons for the fact that the three probably best tech cards right now, Mercury, Cosmic Ghost Rider, and of course Shadow King, are all relevant in the Move matchup. Mercury is carried almost entirely by this matchup. It is not a coincidence that we have seen nerfs to Mercury and Shadow King back to back, only for them to get more important to the metagame because they are now a bigger commitment that decks still have to make. And this deck is why those commitments have to happen, because unchecked, it simply does more points than nearly everything else with an ease and a methodology of playing around the things that beat it that simply make it the best combo deck in Marvel Snap. If you're trying to beat Move, I think there is a degree of if you can't beat them, join them. This is a list that has been doing the rounds in Top Infinite. I got it from a player named Vane Hellslinger. I believe it was covered in other YouTube channels as well. I enjoy this list because it lets me, sort of cope my tech decks. I think we all know at this point what kind of player I am. I like being able to play Red Guardian. I like being able to play my Cosmic Ghost Rider. I like being able to play Mercury. I like being able to just sort of have these kind of answers into a bunch of different things. In any metagame where Cosmic Ghost Rider is relevant, Red Guardian is also, of course, relevant. Being able to pair Cannonball with Mercury is a really powerful thing to do. And so this deck just sort of arrives at like, okay, first things first, I'm a really good Mercury deck. I have Red Guardian. I can answer Madam Web. I can answer a lot of the different things the Move deck does. But I also have a pretty proactive points plan that works with a lot of those cards. Mercury obviously synergizes with Craven, things of that nature. You just get some nice stuff here. I've seen other builds of this deck that strip some tech out in order to get more beef in. I don't like that very much because I think then you sort of end up at the mercy of what your opponent is doing. I also see builds of this deck playing cards like Scream. I really want to emphasize that I think right now Scream might be one of the most overrated cards in Marvel Snap. A lot of people look at Scream and they say, this is how I'm going to beat Move. It just doesn't work. You need it right then. You need it on 2. And even then, they might be capable of moving enough cards that you just don't actually hit the stuff that you want to hit. They might be able to outscale it anyway. Scream is a fine card in the matchup, but she's worse than Mercury. And even Mercury is not really an automatic win the way this game plays out against the Move deck. So I think this deck gets a more consistent upside that has a little bit more tech as well. And I think it's a really well-constructed list that I quite enjoyed playing. If you are a mid-range coper, this is a good list. A lot of people, I think, are treating this as a very combo-oriented meta. And I don't know if maybe I'm just in a different space from other people, or maybe I'm ahead of the curve, or maybe I'm behind the curve. But like, this is a combo-oriented meta, but a lot of what's happening is combo decks seem to be centralizing on a certain amount of payoffs that kind of lose to things like Shadow King and Cosmic Ghost Rider, especially if you're an Arishem deck, a turn 4 Cosmic Ghost Rider. That's a really good thing to be doing. I have not found any cause to make any changes to this deck. I've played around with some things that might help. I've thought about dropping Thanos for Galactus, so we have a better answer into Cerebro 3 type stuff. Alioth is actually an eminently droppable card. I talked about this with Teebs. That is, of course, the person who came up with this list, played it in second place in the Golden Gauntlet. I have made 0 changes from their original list. This is the kind of thing where it's like, Alioth is very cuttable on ladder because everyone kind of respects it anyway. But it's not very cuttable if you are taking this into an open deckless tournament. But yeah, Thanos, Alioth, keep an eye on those as cuts. I really like the tech package in this list because so many people are treating this as like, oh, it is a fait accompli that this is a combo meta. It's just about the numbers I can put up. And it's like, you know, that would be true if we weren't an Arishem deck using our extra energy to compensate for all of the nerfs to all of the tech cards, right? That's what this deck is about. Now, it is very much an Arishem deck. That is a weakness that it has, but it's also a strength, right? You naturally have reasonably decent matchups into the less engine-y, more techy mid-range decks. You also naturally have worse matchups into the, let's say, combo-y decks, but you have every answer in the entire game in there. So it's not like you're dead in the water. The thing you really don't want to see is a sort of all stats deck that just you don't have the tech card for. So that can be a lot of things. If your opponent sets up a Jocasta lane, you don't have the Cosmic Ghost Rider, you're probably going to lose, right? If your opponent is playing the Scar version of the Red Skull deck, right, you're probably going to lose. If your opponent is playing Cerebro and they don't blow it, you're probably going to lose. All of that is true. But you kind of just have the Arishem edge in a lot of other matchups. Here is where Cerebro 3 is right now. This is, I think, a list that a lot of people misunderstand a bit. Very much a list that has the option to do strong things and does those strong things about as well as you can reasonably ask. Where Cerebro 3 really shines right now is just having as many multiples of Cerebro as is possible. Now, that comes with a couple of interesting caveats, which is to say, don't be stupid and get your Cerebro Cosmic Ghost Rider, please. Like that, you do have to still play around stuff. You can't just all in power. A lot of the time, you still want to just like play Cerebro Mystique late, that kind of stuff. There are a very limited amount of cards that can meaningfully interact with you. At High Infinite, people have started playing Echo. I don't really think of that as like a great idea. It's such a nothing card in so many other matchups where like a lot of the other tech cards are at least kind of doing things. But it is kind of the only card that does beat this deck on a consistent basis if you can make the thing hit. That's a real advantage. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it is something you have to be keeping your eye on. The rest of what you need to play around, Enchantress, Cosmic Ghost Rider, you know the deal, right? You know what you have to play around if you're a Cerebro deck. You are going to have a million points. You just need to make sure you're actually snapping aggressively. Cerebro is a great bluff snap deck if you think your opponent isn't a bot, presumably, and a great deck, actually, speaking of bots, if you want to beat bots, banger deck here, all your powers in hand. This is a deck that has a ton of power and is fundamentally fragile in a couple of ways, but instead of being fragile to your opponent's interaction, it's more just fragile to randomly losing the game to a bad location roll. That's the real thing that keeps this deck balanced. It is otherwise one of the strongest decks in the game. The way in which this metagame has centralized, and this could be a sort of week-to-week thing with Move ending up on top, with people playing a bunch of like Man Spider stuff, just generally just a lot of green power running around, that has allowed Victoria Hand to sort of edge her way back into the metagame, just sort of slowly moving back to where she usually is or was before the tech-pocalypse. A deck that is good, solid, very reasonable, nothing bad at all to say about it, but not particularly special. This is a good, solid, powerful deck. The metagame right now is very favorable for Shadow King. Because the metagame is very favorable for Shadow King, Victoria Hand ends up being a good choice because Victoria Hand, as a Shadow King deck, is one of the best. It is one of the most cost-efficient decks in the game, which means when you're relying on a Shadow King, you use your other 3 energy to do some really strong stuff. There are not a lot of decks that can get as much out of the remaining 3 energy on their final turn of the game that they play a Shadow King and then use that other 3 as a Victoria Hand deck. There just simply are not. And that is the biggest competitive advantage that Victoria Hand has. The biggest disadvantage that it has is a relatively capped point ceiling. Like, yeah, sometimes you do Nico Minoru, which copies a V-Hand into a Frigga, get a bunch of V-Hands. Like, yeah, sometimes you really ceiling people out. Sometimes, cloning Vats pops up, right? That's not exactly a reliable ceiling, and it does leave you kind of leaning on Shadow King hard to take down anyone who is competing with your fairly good but not combo deck level ceiling of points. It's a good deck, but I don't know that this is the kind of thing that is a permanent state of affairs, because a lot is riding on Shadow King in a lot of different matchups. I think this deck gets a little bit disrespected because people think of it as like very A to B, kind of like dummy boy Marvel Snap. But it's just good. I think a lot of people look at this and are like, this has to be bad. I think just having a free 10% of games that you instantly win is just a really valuable thing that people consistently underrate because it's easy. This deck has some real legs on it because of that. There are almost no true unwinnable matchups. There's just bad draws in winnable matchups. This is still a very solid deck, though. Like, this is not a metagame. When people are playing a bunch of combo-y type stuff, Storm can be pretty good for disrupting their ability to, like, put their combo out there. There are multiple decks that you're just going to have reasonable cards against, and if you aren't doing that, I mean, you're still playing some pretty big guys. Is it the biggest guys? No, but it's enough of a plan B that you can credibly win games. And that's fine. That's really all you need out of your plan B. In fact, I would argue that this is a better plan B than the deck has ever really had access to. Something that's on my mind as I make this is Galactus First Steps came out, and I think has since proven itself to just kind of be one of the best 6-drops in the game. Not like a special card or anything like that, but over time, it has really established itself as like, this is the default big 6. That's what you do. And as much as things like Electro going to 5 power, it's easy to say they don't matter, and they matter less. But when you're doing Galactus First Step stuff, the fact that you just have a bunch of like legit good bodies in here, every point of power kind of does matter, and that does help. This is a reasonably powerful deck that has a like plan A of instantly winning the game, and a plan B of cheating a lot of energy and playing a bunch of big dudes. There's just nothing wrong with it. The Pixie Chef list is a very solid ceiling play when you are able to just trust that your opponent is not playing Mobius, and that is really true of this metagame. You are extremely able to trust that your opponent is not playing Mobius, and that's an important thing, because if they were, you'd be super screwed, but nobody can, because they have to play Mercury first, because they have to play Cosmic Ghost Rider first, because they have to play, above all else, Shadow King first. And so if you can deploy a bunch of power on the final turn of the game, the cards that this deck doesn't want to see, Mobius and Mobius, to a lesser extent Juggernaut, are just massively less played than they were, I don't know, when everyone was playing all of them in every deck ever in the Invisible Woman meta, right? Like, this is an example of how context can really change a deck, because this deck basically goes from fully unplayable garbage to the metagame is genuinely finally right for what this deck is capable of. We are in a pretty ceiling heavy metagame. This is a deck that can do ceiling very well. We are in a very Shadow King heavy metagame. This is a deck that can throw priority while still doing ceiling. We are in a very Mobius light metagame. This deck instantly loses to Mobius. A lot of things line up. Context is key here. Like, this is not a deck that I think I would recommend you like hyper invest in. If you're like, okay, KM says this deck is good, I should go out and get it. Pump the brakes a little bit, because the context is really important here. For this deck, I would argue more than a lot of other decks. Upsides of the Splombo, as I have taken to calling the Splat Onslaught combo list, are that it is not vulnerable to things like Shadow King and things like Mercury. Downsides are that you kind of instantly die to Cosmic Ghost Rider and Enchantress. And, you know, I think you could reasonably argue Shadow King and Mercury are 1 and 2. Those are the most played tech cards in this metagame. 3 and 4 are definitely the ones that beat you, though. So this deck is an extremely high ceiling deck. What it can do when not disrupted is incredibly powerful. There is no way around that kind of conversation. The numbers here are immense. You can do ridiculous stuff in this deck. You have no control over whether or not your opponent has the cards that screw you over, though, and that is fundamentally the issue here. I think that this is also a deck that weirdly makes Mr. Negative worse. When we talk about the Mr. Negative concept, Mr. Negative, we just talked about how nobody's playing Mobius, you get all this stuff for free. The thing is, I'm not actually sure if this deck gets its best draw and Mr. Negative gets its best draw, that you win the matchup. And that's not the only thing that that's true of, right? Like, there are multiple decks where it's like, I've Mr. Negatived all this stuff, and then you still lose. And I think that that is a really important piece of this metagame as well. It's the sort of diversification of the ways in which combos happen, because there are multiple, like, on-board type of combo decks. A lot of them aren't very on-reveal focused, and that means that your gore is a lot smaller, and if you can't count on gore being big, it's really just an Iron Man Mystique angle, and if you don't flip one of them, suddenly you're really staring down like not as much point output as some of the combo decks. And I think that's largely the thing that this deck is informing, right? Like, this is one of those decks where it's like, if I play this into Mr. Negative, I don't really feel that bad. I don't even know if they can just outpoint me. They've really got to get lucky to make that happen. I feel like I kind of spoiled the Mr. Negative part of this discussion, but largely you'd think that this is a great metagame for Mr. Negative because nobody's playing Mobius. Awesome. Great. Super dope. There are some combo decks that are going to out-ceiling you. I think this is still a pretty good Mr. Negative metagame. I don't want people to think that, like, oh, it's just terrible, it's awful, it's garbage. It's not. A lot of the reasons why we talked about the Pixie Chef deck being good also apply to Mr. Negative, arguably more, but you are kind of all in here in a way that you are not in other decks that could plausibly get owned by Mobius. And so while it is more rewarding to be all in because people aren't Mobiusing you, there are still matchups like when you play against Move, you kind of like you kind of got to wonder if you're actually going to beat that Human Torch. You know what I mean? And if they get it right, well, how are you going to be able to do all of the things you need to do? I've seen Move decks, no, not Move decks. I've seen Negative decks playing Shang-Chi with their Null package for that matchup. Like, I've seen that happening. It's like, I don't even know if I can concretely say that that's a bad idea. Like, that might actually be the kind of thing you need to do. And that's horrifying, right? You're Mr. Negative. You're supposed to be the ceiling deck. That's what you do. And if it gets to that point, it's like, oh, geez, I don't know. I don't know about this list. Ongoing is for sure an underrated list. And I'm highlighting the Safety Blade build of it because I think this is a strong contender for a very underrated deck. What this deck is doing is taking the same approach that the Move deck took and saying, here is my good points package that can, when I draw well, really get me to combo levels of point output. But I've also got Juggernaut. I've also got Shadow King. I've also got Echo. I have these answers to relevant cards in the metagame. Echo for Cerebro, Shadow King for Move, Juggernaut for whatever, right? That is sort of a time-honored deck-building strategy, and Ongoing is a pretty damn solid list. I also generally like being less of an Iron Man deck. One of the things I have found is that I am just woefully prone to playing an Iron Man in the front of lanes and getting heinously Cosmic Ghost Ridered. And I think a lot of the time it's like how you have to play the deck, and that's not a fun thing to be doing because you want to be able to invest the Iron Man where you haven't already invested a lot of the time, so you get to like follow it up with some other stuff, you know? That's not a line of play that I find particularly compelling right now. So instead, this deck takes the approach that is similar to the Hydra Stomper deck, where I've got some relevant tech, I've got a lot of points, I've got some good things to be doing in this metagame. All right, let's go do those good things. The Smiz Casta combo deck is very real, but this is one of those decks where it's just like, okay, we are doing a lot of stuff that fundamentally super eats it to a Shadow King, depending on how priority works. We are pretty good at throwing priority, so that's nice. The world in which we throw priority, though, is the world in which we get heinously rug pulled by a Cosmic Ghost Rider. So, seeing as how those are fairly popular tech cards, this deck gets put in very awkward spots by the potential for those cards existing. I would really like to play a version of this deck that isn't like that, but that is a fundamentally true thing about how this deck plays out. It just kind of is like that. You will get got. You kind of just have to deal with it. And because of that, a deck that I think is really interestingly positioned, if that wasn't true, ends up just falling down the tier list a bit to the point that it's at. I really like this deck. It's quite cool, but that 1-2 punch is really hard to navigate. Manspider gets a bad rap, but fundamentally is doing some pretty ridiculously strong stuff. I am not sure that there is something here necessarily so much as like, this is a 50%-ish deck where it's like, if you do what you want to do, and you do what you want to do very well and very consistently, you're going to have a billion points. There are cards that totally obliterate you, and it might not be the best to be investing extremely heavily in stuff like this in the Shadow Kingest metagame we have ever had. But the fact that this deck is still pretty good, still putting up numbers, I still see people playing it in the Shadow Kingest meta we've ever had, I do think it kind of orients me to the idea that, like, I think this is like maybe a bit of a sleeping giant. I'm not saying it will break out at some point, but I'm saying that I can very easily envision a metagame where this deck just absolutely shits on everything. It just isn't this metagame. The numbers here really are immense. I can't stress that enough. You get a bunch of points a lot of the time. You are very much being gatekept by some of the more powerful interactive pieces here. And that's an interesting thing to file away for the future. A couple of archetypal decks here. We're going to start with Destroy, which I still believe is pretty much the best of these iterations. This is genuinely, I don't know how many times I can make the same video, make the same segment on Destroy. It's underrated. This is a good deck. Like, this is just actually a good deck. It's a very solid B+ player in this metagame. Is it the greatest thing you've ever played? No. Are there things that beat you? Yes. A lot of tech cards are relevant against Destroy. It's the world's most predictable deck. The best you can do is get things to like 50-50s in guessing games, but your numbers are pretty good, and it's a fun, enjoyable deck that has a lot of upside in it. Just a very reasonable floor and a very high ceiling. You don't hit your high ceiling very much. That's usually what puts you behind other combo decks, is your ability to access your ceiling, where other decks have a lot more access to their ceiling because they have a lot more time in which they can make things happen. Move, for example, you can draw Human Torch late and still get him to 40 power. You draw Deadpool late, he is not getting to 40 power. And that kind of stuff is largely what holds Destroy back. This card isn't bad. It is a deck that pretty meaningfully puts points on the board while throwing priority and dodging Shadow King. You do get kind of got by Cosmic Ghost Rider a decent amount of the time, but throwing priority, dodging Shadow King, you're pretty good at that. A lot of people playing Mercury does nothing against you. You do really eat it to the combo matchups where they can go tall. If this deck has a meaningful weakness, it is that the presence of all of this crap in the metagame, all the Shadow King stuff, has pushed us toward the smaller version of discard, because the bigger version of discard, the Dakin one with Bullseye, really eats it to Cosmic Ghost Rider and Shadow King. You don't want that, so you end up here, and you only kind of eat it to Cosmic Ghost Rider and don't eat it to Shadow King, but in exchange, your ceiling is really small. Like, you are a much smaller deck in terms of total output, and a little more predictable too. Oh, my move opponent knows that their Human Torch is going to be a jillion billion power, so they put it in my Dracula lane, and my Apocalypse, okay, they have the 24 power of Dracula, and their Human Torch is like 75, and you're just like, okay, that was great. That's the biggest issue that Discard has. It's a pretty solid, consistent deck, but I don't think that it ceilings with the best of them. Ajax, of course, the Afflict list is a very reasonable list. I also have seen the Husky Puppies list that is like, all right, let's get rid of the Quicksilver even, let's get rid of the Wiccan, let's do all of this stuff. That also led to a Darkhawk list built on similar principles. I would guess Ajax is still the most interesting of them. This is a reasonably strong list, but it also has those ceiling issues. This is a deck that is best built for mid-range metagames where it can be bigger than other mid-range decks. That's not where we are right now, and you will get ceilinged by the combo decks, which is why, of course, we are also a Shadow King deck like everyone else in this metagame. So there's play here. Like, you're not instantly dead, but you are going to have some games where it's like, all right, well, this is a matchup where Shadow King is really good. I now have to choose between playing Shadow King on 3 to make my Wiccan happen and not making my Wiccan happen. Like, it's not great. This is a strong-ish deck, but it is very much in the same space as like something like V-Hand without the same level of consistent access to efficient points that V-Hand has, and definitely a lot of the same reliance on a Shadow King in those matchups. I'm going to start here, which is to say, I'm going to say the good things about this deck first. This is the best zombie deck at existing in a Shadow King Mercury meta. Okay? That's where we're at. Shadow King Mercury means you don't really want to be a Werewolf by Night deck. It means this cannonball stuff is really important to get points on the board without being a green power deck. But let's zoom out here, right? This is a deck that by nature, by virtue of being what it is, has a big card on the board holding up a sign that says, please Shadow King me. I'm begging you to Shadow King me. And I gotta tell you, people are very happy to do it. So while I do believe this is the best build of zombies for this metagame, I believe that with all of my heart. Fundamentally, it might be time to put this away until Shadow King goes back into his little hole or wherever he lives. Last of our archetypal decks is, of course, the Tens deck. If you're looking for an Ezekiel Sims deck, this is probably the only one. If you're looking for a deck that has like a very interesting matchup profile, this is also a good pick. This deck is so interesting to me because the matchup profile, there aren't exactly other decks that have this profile. For example, this deck really beats Arishem, like just heinously, brutally. Basically any reasonable draw from this deck just beats Arishem. They don't have stuff for this. All of their cards are smaller than all of your cards. You win heinously, right? But also, you kind of lose to like every combo deck. It's a weird dynamic because you're both points decks, and I think it's probably worth talking about like what a combo deck is and when I say that, because I don't know that it's the right terminology. When I talk about combo decks, fundamentally, I'm referring to like a super class of decks where the plan is I'm going to make a lot of points by using the synergies between my cards, and I am not going to meaningfully interact with my opponent to stop them from doing it. Thus, I am going to only do my own game plan and combo out, and whoever combos bigger, they are the one who's going to win. This is a deck that it's like, it doesn't feel right to call it combo, but it is. That's what it is when I use the word to mean that in that way. I almost think it might be better to describe combo decks as more just like, you know, these are two ships decks, referring to two ships passing in the night. This deck has a smaller ceiling than most other decks that are not willing to play interaction. That's where we're at. That's a fact. That's just how it is. You could maybe, I hate to say it, maybe you could alleviate this by cutting Surtur for Shadow King, and then you'll just be every other deck that's playing a proactive game plan for 11 cards and then Shadow King. But you get what I'm saying here, right? Like, okay, yeah, we have Enchantress. That's tech, right? We're interacting. No, we're not. That's for turning off our cards. If it happens to get value, that's cool. But that's not why we're playing it, right? And so this is a deck that has kind of a lot of points in it. It's really good at beating up a lot of the smaller mid-range decks because it's just a bunch of points and none of their interaction is good against you. And that's a reasonable spot to be in, but you do have to be a little bit cautious when queuing this deck because you get massively ceilinged by the elite combo decks. Upside, though, you beat the crap out of C3 as long as you don't Sauron away Red Skull. Iris is one of my favorite deck builders in Marvel Snap, so when she sent me this list, I kind of immediately assessed it as I think this is doing a lot of the same stuff as the Hydra Stomper deck on this video. Like, if you zoom out, a lot of what this deck is doing is extremely similar. There's just a couple of different choices being made here. For example, this deck is much more teched against Cerebro. Echo, of course, excellent against Cerebro. But another card that's really good against Cerebro is Thing First Steps. And so this is a deck that has a sort of similar premise. Like, we have our relevant tech. We got Echo for Cerebro. We got Thing First Steps for Cerebro. We've got Mercury for the move decks. Thing First Steps, not bad against the move decks. We're a Juggernaut deck. We can cover a lot of things like that. It's in a very similar space of like redistributive points and tech. I would suspect that the Hydra Stomper deck is just a little better in terms of ceiling, and this deck is a little more teched against pretty much specifically Cerebro, but I do think it's a nice enough deck to showcase a sort of different approach to what I would describe as like the same answer. Like, this is a different direction to arrive at a similar space. And I think that kind of stuff is really interesting in deck building. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. I have been KMBest. I really appreciate you watching. Remember to like and subscribe. I will see you in the next one. You have been phenomenal.